Renz with Ohio Stands Up to provide proponent testimony. Many members that may be here today are from other are in another room, so we'll be waiting to make sure that they have time to come to this room. He's coming. Thank you. Heard him coming. Welcome.
Thank you. We're just going to stick to the script today. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here, and I really appreciate you bumping me up the schedule. So, in March of 2020, Governor DeWine and the Department of Health made a determination that they were going to place all Ohioans under house arrest for 2 weeks to flatten the curve. They said at the time that they were going to do this because hospitals were going to be overrun with patients and people would be dying in the streets. It was going to be a terrible thing. The people of Ohio trusted the governor and the Department of Health, and they agreed to accept this 2-week crisis intervention. They agreed to the most drastic curtailment of rights ever taken in American history. Without due process, people were asked to lock down in their houses for 2 weeks. At the time, though, this seemed fishy to me. The reason it did is I was watching the numbers on this disease. At that time, the disease appeared to have about a 4% case fatality rate and a reproduction rate that was only, at the time, thought to be a little bit higher than the flu. Put this in perspective, the original SARS virus had a 9% fatality rate and roughly similar reproduction rate or spread rate. And the original MERS had over a 30% fatality rate and a similar spread rate. And for neither of those diseases did we ever consider or even discuss doing the same sort of thing. TB, which is not in my testimony, but I will tell you has roughly a 10% fatality rate, is still alive and well in this country. No one's locking down people. No one shut down our country. No one shut down our airports. We just live with it. We dodge it. We do what we can. We do what's necessary. But we live with it. The Ohioans were never told the background of these numbers. Okay? The numbers that suggested this curve was coming. This was based on modeling, right? This modeling was created by a group of scientists, and if you look into the scientists, if you look into the background of these scientists, they've created models in the past. Those models have typically been wrong, way wrong in some cases. But yet we relied on them to curtail our rights in the most drastic way ever to happen in American history. Thankfully, and we can demonstrate this by the fact, I don't know if you all remember, but we created a bunch of facilities for the overrun that was going to occur because of this curve, this dreaded curve. I believe the IX Center in Cleveland was filled with hospital beds. Thankfully, the models were wrong, and that facility went unused. As we move forward in time, especially up to this point, what we've learned with absolute no question is that we were wrong about some things. I was wrong as well, and I'll tell you what I was wrong about. I figured that the case fatality rate, spread rate, were going to end up maybe a little higher than the flu, or at least a real bad year. The reality is that right now we're looking at about a 0.5% fatality rate, maybe less than 0.25%. It's hard to get accurate numbers. I've got a few lawsuits to discuss why that is precisely, but essentially you should know that the way that we count a death for COVID-19 is different than the way that we count a death for any other cause of death in the United States. It is the only disease where the cause of death is determined in the way that it is. Every other disease in the United States is the same way. So, the disease is far less dangerous than we thought. It doesn't really spread any faster than what we live with every year. But it is a real disease, and let me make clear to everyone here, I'm not a COVID denier. I believe it's a disease. I've lost people close to me, very close to me. And one in particular I lost was one of the closest people in my life. But that individual, whether it was actually from COVID-19 because of his age and comorbidities, we'll never know. And it was the end of his life. So that's what we're seeing in a lot of COVID-19 deaths, right? That's the truth. A lot of these deaths are occurring end of life, and because of the way we're categorizing COVID-19, because of the fact that we've given so much leeway and we're offering funding for people to find a COVID-19 death, it's being categorized that way. Get back on script. Another indisputable fact, the governor keeps talking about his science. I'm calling it political science because it's certainly not science according to any of the doctors or scientists that I'm working with. And these are people who are independent, by the way. One of the things that I have to do, and for me to have any credibility in my work, I have to make sure that these doctors and these scientists that I'm working with, that I will eventually call in court to testify under oath, are credible, they're not biased, and they don't have financial interests. The real science behind this isn't being followed, and let me give you a few examples. Our schools are closed still, for the most part. We're moving towards opening now. But we've known for months this isn't dangerous to kids. Kids aren't vectors of transmission. The CDC's even said this. The CDC is not exactly COVID averse. I mean, these guys are doing everything they can to keep this emergency alive and well. So for them to come out and say that kids aren't vectors of transmission is really something. Why didn't we open the doors immediately? The science doesn't matter here. It's politics. No child under 19 has died in Ohio from COVID-19 as of the last time I looked. Now, granted, that wasn't yesterday, but I'm fairly sure that it would have been on every single newspaper in the state if it had happened, especially if it was credible. Back to the science. If we're following the science, I have a question. Does COVID have a watch? Is it a nocturnal hunter? Why is it more dangerous at 11 o'clock than 10 o'clock? Why did we decide that a curfew was somehow going to be sensible? What did that do other than hurt bars and restaurants? Scientifically, can anyone explain to me why we thought that a curfew would do anything at all other than damage bars and restaurants? I don't know. The war on small businesses, I point to as another very clear demonstration of the lack of real science here. Can you tell me why Walmart's open, but a church is not? Why a Walmart is open, but your local small business is not? These, in many cases, sell the same sorts of things. There's a lot more people in a Walmart than there is in your local small business. Most of the local and independently owned businesses that I go to, and I try to go as often as I can to keep them in business, because they need that right now. There's one or two people in there at a time, it's shocking. Where's the science here? The governor keeps telling us about the science. This science seems to be political science. And in my opinion, this political science is probably, it seems to be top secret, because when we ask for modeling and we ask for data, raw data, not data that's been whitewashed by the Department of Health or other statisticians, but when I ask for raw data, I get a resounding silence. Maybe there's no time. We believe that the data he's got is political science. We're curious whether that political science that he seems to be getting from some of these big corporations and political influences, it certainly seems that it would be interesting, and we're curious as to whether any of the stock ownership interests or donations that have been given to the governor or his family have had anything to do with this political science that he's using. We're not making any accusations at this point. But we do find it curious because we've looked at the financial disclosure forms. There's some interesting things there. The big businesses, they're doing well, right? And they're the ones that have the money to donate. We're also curious why no investigation's been done on this under ORC 29, 21, 42, and 43. We'll leave that at that. Third fact. It appears very strongly that the governor's political science, his interests, far more about his political future than he is about the concerns for the the Ohio people. I've got a few things for you here. The leading cause of death for children between 10 and 14 in Ohio is suicide. Okay, one more time. The leading cause of death for children 10 to 14 in Ohio is suicide. I have a 10-year-old child. This is dear to my heart. I've watched what this has done, what the school closures, what the fear that they've pushed on these kids has done to them. I've heard about a person who asked me to represent them, and I couldn't, I didn't have the time. About a 10-year-old child who was so afraid of COVID transmitting through saliva that he refused to swallow or eat because he was scared of his own saliva and ended up hospitalized. What are we doing to these kids? What are we doing? We're certainly not keeping them safe because COVID isn't killing them. We are. We, the adults who have failed our children, are allowing them to die. Our seniors, I'm watching seniors die alone. Do you know how many times a week I get phone calls, because I'm one of the few lawyers that will work on this, from someone, my mom's dying, my dad was married to her for 50 years, he just wants to say goodbye, what can we do? I'm sorry, nothing in the time that you have left. I'm very frustrated because when I have to say that to someone, it is just absolutely crushing to my soul. Because it should, and I would argue is illegal, but I can't do anything quickly enough through the proper channels to fix it. I get calls from people with PTSD, some with mental issues, some of them are vets from war zones, some are abused women. One I will never forget. I couldn't take her case either because I'm booked 24/7. She begged me to get into her psychiatrist because she was suicidal. Her psychiatrist, a medical doctor, someone who was trained, who knew that she had been choked and abused in the past, and knew that she couldn't wear a mask because of that. She begged me to get him in because she was considering killing herself, and he refused to see her because she couldn't wear a mask. And she would rather die than wear that mask because of what happened to her. These people are discriminated against. I have another client, has a very serious medical condition, not capable of wearing a mask, literally puts her at physical danger, discriminated against on a constant basis in every store that she goes to. Separate but equal. I thought we got rid of that a few years back. And what are we basing it on? What are we basing this on, right? A disease that in most of our population has a well over 99.9% recovery rate. Let me tell you where some of this is coming from that you may or may not know, and it may or may not be interesting for you. There's a group called Resolve to Save Lives. They're helping in Ohio. We can't get a clear answer on to what extent, but we believe it's substantial. They're led by a former Obama White House CDC advisor. They're funded by, and this is what's important, a number of billionaire charities, Bloomberg Philanthropies, Gates Foundation, Zuckerberg Initiative. Now, each one of these philanthropies, these good and honest charities, have ties to ownership in or some relationship to the world of medical business. I'm not making any accusations here, but it certainly seems there may be a conflict. And when they create these shell companies or organizations like Resolve to Save Lives that are put out there to try and look like they're doing something good, they give them a good name, Resolve to Save Lives. Who wouldn't want to save lives, right? Well, the 10 to 14-year-olds that are killing themselves, lives are not being saved. Testing for this disease. It's garbage. I don't know how else to say it. It is absolute garbage. The PCR testing, okay? So we all know about the PCR test. We had the drive-through PCR tests. These are the most egregiously absurd things I've seen. Mind you, I learned this from my doctors and my scientists. The PCR test is a brilliant test created by a Nobel laureate who said that it shouldn't be used for diagnostic purposes. Now, that's been fact-checked. Let me tell you what a little bit more about that, right? The PCR test is a chemical test. It tests for viral RNA fragments. Okay, so it doesn't necessarily test for a whole complete piece of a virus, a viral particle. It looks for pieces of it. That can be indicative of a disease, or it may not. What it doesn't do is by itself provide any evidence of an infection at all. I can back this up. Now, we're using in Ohio, I know at least we were, and again, because the governor is not forthright about any information, I don't know to what extent. I've heard as much as 40% of our kits are coming from Mako Labs. And their kit is listed in my testimony. It is the Applied Biosystems TAC-PATH kit. And it says in their instruction manual for that kit, it detects pieces of RNA. It doesn't detect an infection or a disease. And pieces of RNA, because I had to learn this from my doctor advisors, I'll share this with you. RNA means that there's a piece of a disease that was found in your body. There's always viruses in your body. Your immune system fights it off. Only when you get to a certain threshold, a certain viral load, enough of a virus in your body, do you actually get sick, right? This doesn't test for an actual amount of virus or viral load, just the presence. Let me read you this direct quote from the manual, the instruction manual for this test. And I'm going to save you part of this. The entire quote is in my testimony, but clinical correlation with patient history and other diagnostic information is necessary to determine patient infection. That means, according to the instruction kit for the test kit, a drive-through test is meaningless. Clinical correlation. That means that you got to have a doctor take a look and decide whether or not there's anything there for any real meaningful result from this test kit. Now, I won't say that PCR test is useless. That could be fact-checked, and that would be, I would say, inaccurate. But a PCR test by itself is absolutely useless.
Mr. Renz?
Yes, sir.
If I could, although I appreciate your testimony, can you bring it to, we were going to have about 20 to 25 more testimonies coming up just on this topic.
Yes, sir.
Is there a way that you might be able to, although this is all very good, maybe talk about how, maybe finalize your testimony and try to bring it into how this bill, which might bring some oversight, could help out? Would you be able to do that?
Absolutely I can, and I can do that very quickly. HB90 actually it should already be law, and I would argue it is, but this brings authority back where it belongs, okay? We have an unelected group of bureaucrats and an executive branch making law. That's your job. It's certainly not the governor's job. How we ever came to the idea that a health department order should cover the entire state is mind-blowing to me. A health department that has the power for orders so that they can shut down the restaurant that has maggots in their food, so that they can create a solution to a small localized problem. When it affects the entire state, I would argue it's a regulation. They don't have the authority to do that. That's a separation of powers issue. That's your job. House Bill 90 reminds them of that in no uncertain terms. We're arguing that before the courts, and we're going to continue to argue that amongst other things, but House Bill 90 is faster, right? If you guys pass this and you move on, guess what? It just says in plain language, rather than me arguing a separation of powers issue, is it a rule, is it an order, is it a regulation? This brings it all back to where it belongs. It gives you the oversight that you must have. Our children are dying. Our seniors are dying alone. This is something that is disproportionately affecting minority communities. It is disproportionately affecting small business. It is disproportionately hitting the middle class. You have the responsibility to legislate in this state according to our Constitution. House Bill 90 allows you to retake that authority. I absolutely implore this committee and the rest of the legislature to have the courage not to water down this bill, and also to pass what will inevitably, override what will inevitably be a veto. Because apparently the governor is far more worried about his political future than the good of Ohioans. I thank you so much for your time. It's an honor and a privilege to be here, and I pray that we do the right thing.
Thank you. Will you take questions from the committee?
Absolutely.
Okay. Does the committee have questions? Representative Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for coming in today. I know that in your comments you focused a lot on the science and things of that nature, but you are an attorney. And so on the analysis of this bill, there is some question about whether or not it would be constitutional. So I didn't know if you cared to weigh in and talk about why it is, because again, the comment on the analysis is that there could be a constitutional question regarding this piece of legislation.
Absolutely. So I haven't seen that analysis yet, and I'd be happy to give you a written review if you'd like. But what I can tell you is, based on my review of the legislation, I don't see why there'd be a question of constitutionality. I think the only question of constitutionality that's occurring right now is why the executive branch seems to think that it's a legislature. We understand that if an emergency happens for a week, that there may be drastic measures that have to occur. We're almost a year into this, and we've all heard from every doctor out there, COVID's not going anywhere. So the constitutional question to me is, when did our executive branch decide that it can make law? Because that's essentially what's happening here. All this is providing a check and balance. I believe that this is very good for the constitutional separation of powers, and I think it's very much a legal and a good decision to make.
Follow up?
Yeah,
Follow
thank
up.
you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Now, I would be interested for you to take a look at the analysis. It's available online on the Ohio Legislature website, but I just wanted to sort of explore a topic that we have talked at great length about in this committee in the previous General Assembly, which is about the data regarding the cases and the argument about whether it is or isn't available. Because what we had talked about in the last General Assembly is just about the way in which the data is presented instead of the raw data, because if you are not necessarily an expert, then it makes it more difficult to figure out exactly how the raw data might go. And so part of the reason why it's presented how it is to make it more easily digestible by the general public and people who don't necessarily have expertise in epidemiology or public health or anything of that nature. And again, I mean, I really have a lot of concerns because we've heard people come in and say, the science isn't the science and the data is not the data. But then we have epidemiologists and health professionals and people who have educational background in public health saying, this is the facts. And, sometimes I think in this body, Mr. Chairman, we don't always agree on things, but, now we're at a point where we don't even agree on what facts are facts. And so I just wasn't sure if you had any thoughts about that.
I do very much, and I'm really glad that you said that. The fact that this has been politicized makes me sick. This is a freedom issue, not a right and left issue. Should be about saving lives. How can we make decisions about saving lives when we have the CDC defining a new means for determining cause of death for one disease? When we compare deaths to this disease, to any other disease, it's garbage. You can bring in any epidemiologist you want. If they tell you that when you measure something differently, it's a useful comparison, they're lying. And I'd be happy to bring in plenty of epidemiologists to do that. In fact, in my testimony, and I will reiterate, I'm happy to bring everything that I'm saying here in under oath with citations and back it all up. We can do that. We will do that. We're working through the court system to try and get the opportunity to do that. This should not be right and left, and we should not be fighting over facts. The question I would ask the people who are saying that I'm incorrect or lying is, who are you working for and how much are you getting paid? Because inevitably, I'm finding that they typically are working for someone or getting paid somewhere. This is really not something that, what are they going to argue about? The instruction manual for the COVID test? Or are they going to argue with the U07.1 usage code from the CDC? This isn't debatable. I'm using their words, not mine. So I'm sad because I've seen, and I'm working with a group of doctors, brilliant physicians, who are very upset because they're concerned because early treatment protocols aren't being used properly. A couple of them have been fired for pushing it. We may or may not be filing suit on their behalf because we believe they've been terminated for trying to save lives. Hospital systems are making a lot of money when you come in and you're a COVID case. If we start having malpractice cases on that, boy, that's going to be a problem. We should not be politicizing science or life. Our life is too important, and the people of Ohio's lives are too important. Is that me? Oh my God, I'm so sorry. I forget that I even had these things. I am so sorry. Let me apologize to you all.
That's okay. That's quite all right. Are there any other questions from the committee? Representative Grindell.
I don't have a question. I just want to thank you for your testimony. And I believe that this is one of the most dangerous orders to close down the state that we've ever had in the state of Ohio, and so damaging in so many ways. Thank you.
Thank you for your courage, Representative.
And Mr. Renz, I appreciate, you brought a lot of data, at least, you're bringing the other side to the table, and I think that's one of the things that we're looking at for HB90. If I may say, it's an opportunity to try to bring expertise to the table, have these questions, and have this dialogue. I actually think it brings transparency, and I would think that an executive, at some point in time, a governor would probably think it's a good thing to start bringing in more people that want to have conversations about this, people that want to talk about the constitutionality of it. There are, as you said, epidemiologists that are willing to come in and talk. There's one thing we could say, okay, we need to rip 3701 out of the Ohio Revised Code and start over. I actually would think that'd be a good thing, but that may be a bridge too far. On some of these things, I would be interested, as an attorney, on Representative Kelly's question, I would be interested to have you send to our committee maybe your look at those constitutionality questions. And I know that two of them in particular are, one is, does the General Assembly have the authority to rescind orders with 50 plus one. And so this is actually something that Senator McCauley, an attorney, also would say that is already found in the code. So if we need to restructure things, we can restructure, but we know that's already found in the code. And the second thing that, if you would look at, would be the, whether or not the order can go away after a 30-day deadline if we do nothing, because that's just been brought up. However, currently, if my understanding is correctly, in current law, an order stands for 120 days. and then must be reissued in some sort of format. Do you have it? You don't have to, if you want to do research, that's fine, but I would love to get your opinions on those as you take a look at those questions.
So what I can tell you right now is this. So under the Ohio Revised Code, after 120 days, an emergency, or a regulation issued under an emergency is invalid, okay? And has to go through the traditional process, which makes sense, right? I mean, we have a checks and balance based system here for a reason. The governor was never supposed to be the legislature. So one of the things that we've brought up is that issue. Now, what they're doing is they're saying, well, you know, under Section 3700, well, we're making orders, right? These are orders. These aren't regulations. They're orders. If you tell me that you have to shut my restaurant down because there's something wrong with it and I'm violating health code, that's an order. When it affects the entire population of the state, that's typically a regulation. And this is a very high-level overview, but basically one of the things that you have to understand is Ohio has an Administrative Procedures Act, okay? And that's a very, very important piece of law. And what's critical to know about that is this. We have a separation of powers in Ohio. The legislature makes the law, the governor, the executive enforces the law. Years ago, in the United States and in Ohio, we decided to become what's known as an administrative state. And what that means is the legislature delegated some rulemaking power to the executive, and the executive took that power. But there has to be limits, right? You can't, under the Constitution, in my opinion, delegate all of your rulemaking authority, all of your legislative authority to the governor, because what you've done then is you've invalidated the constitutional role that you have as a legislative branch and just made him king. The governor's legal position right now is that because he called this an emergency, he can do whatever he wants for eternity. I don't see how that could ever be construed as not being a violation of the separation of powers, particularly when we have the plain language of the law that says where there's an emergency, a regulation made under that emergency will expire after 120 days, right? So one of two things must be true. Either the law that applies to the health department and its orders is unconstitutional for violating the separation of powers, or the governor's violating the law. So whether I just don't see how there's another way to argue that. You know, the idea that we can just say it's a public health order and quarantine an entire state of healthy people with no due process, that's absurd. At no point could any reasonable attorney, in my opinion, go into a courtroom and make the argument that that was either the intent or the language of the law. I just don't think it is. So I think that's really an important issue. I will look into these, and I will give you guys a nice little rundown of my thoughts on this, and I'll even run it by some smart lawyers. So, you know, I'm happy to do that and to get it back to you with kind of a full analysis of it.
Okay, thank you. Representative Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was just going to say maybe we can also check with LSC about the 120-day rule and get their input on that.
We'll do that.
I would recommend that when you ask them about the parent, or at least the governor's contention, that there's a substantial difference between a regulation and an order. Or he's saying that that orders can be statewide and they can last in perpetuity, apparently, because there's, according to the governor, apparently no end to the emergency until he says it's over. Well, what do we do with that? I mean, is he now king to wine? Because that's really where we're at. You know, ultimately, if I can say, and by the way, even the worst case scenario, let's say you don't believe my numbers, and going to your point, Representative Kelly. Let's say that you want to argue that my numbers are wrong. Even in the worst case scenario, the fatality rate of this disease is nowhere near the original SARS or MERS. Nowhere near it. The spread rate is not substantially higher than any of these either. So here's the thing. One thing that we have to be aware of, if we don't do something about this, any year we got a bad flu, we can call it a pandemic, we can declare an emergency, and we're right back here. And that's terrifying to me, because how many small businesses do we have to lose? How many people, how many kids have to kill themselves? You know, I mean, think about that. I think of my baby, my 10-year-old baby, 10 years old, it's a baby. Can you imagine a 10-year-old being in a position where they felt that taking their own life was the only solution? That's what we're doing to our kids.
Right. Thank you for your testimony today.
I appreciate it. I'm honored to be here, and I do look forward to seeing how this comes through. I will have you guys some additional information very soon.
Okay, thank you. Due to the amount of individuals that want to testify for House Bill 90, we are going